Hello and welcome to Bitesized Audio on YouTube. I'm Simon Stanhope, actor, audiobook narrator, and curator of this channel. On the channel you can hear my narrations, more than 100 to date and more to come, of classic short stories, mostly from the Victorian and Edwardian eras, including vintage ghost stories, detective stories, and other classic tales of mystery and suspense. To accompany the narrations, I've put a short profile of the authors in the video description, as well as some general background notes on the stories for those who'd like to know more. If you enjoy this content, please hit subscribe, like, share, leave a comment if you'd like to, and thank you for listening. A Princess's Vengeance by Catherine Louisa Pirkis. The girl is young, pretty, friendless, and a foreigner, you say, and has disappeared as completely as if the earth had opened to receive her, said Miss Brooke, making a resume of the facts that Mr. Dyer had been relating to her. Now, will you tell me why 2 days were allowed to elapse before the police were communicated with? Mrs. Druce, the lady to whom Lucie Cunier acted as amanuensis, answered Mr. Dyer, took the matter very calmly at first, and said she felt sure that the girl would write to her in a day or so, explaining her extraordinary conduct. Major Druce, her son, the gentleman who came to me this morning, was away from home on a visit when the girl took flight. Immediately on his return, however, he communicated the fullest particulars to the police. They do not seem to have taken up the case very heartily at Scotland Yard. No, they have as good as dropped it. They advised Major Druce to place the matter in my hands, saying that they considered it a case for private rather than police investigation. I wonder what made them come to that conclusion. I think I can tell you, although the Major seemed quite at a loss on the matter. It seems he had a photograph of the missing girl, which he kept in a drawer of his writing table. By the way, I think the young man has a good deal gone on this Mademoiselle Cunier, in spite of his engagement to another lady. Well, this portrait he naturally thought would be most useful in helping to trace the girl, and he went to his drawer for it, intending to take it with him to Scotland Yard. To his astonishment, however, it was nowhere to be seen, and although he at once instituted a rigorous search, and questioned his mother and the servants, one and all, on the matter, it was all to no purpose. Loveday thought for a moment. "Well, of course," she said presently, "that photograph must have been stolen by someone in the house, and equally, of course, that someone must know more on the matter than he or she cares to avow, and, most probably, has some interest in throwing obstacles in the way of tracing the girl. At the same time, however, the fact in no way disproves the possibility that a crime, and a very black one, may underlie the girl's disappearance. The Major himself appears confident that a crime of some sort has been committed, and he grew very excited and a little mixed in his statements more than once just now." "What sort of woman is the Major's mother?" "Mrs. Druce. She is rather a well-known personage in certain sets. Her husband died about 10 years ago, and since his death she has posed as promoter and propagandist of all sorts of benevolent, though occasionally somewhat visionary, ideas. Theatrical missions, magic lantern and playing cards missions, societies for providing perpetual music for the sick poor, for supplying cabmen with comforters, and 100 other similar schemes have in turn occupied her attention. Her house is a rendezvous for faddists of every description. The latest fad, however, seems to have put all others to flight. It is a scheme for alleviating the condition of our sisters in the East, so she puts it in her prospectus. In other words, a harem mission, on somewhat similar, but I suppose broader lines, than the old-fashioned Zenana mission. This harem mission has gathered about her a number of Turkish and Egyptian potentates, resident in or visiting London, and has thus, incidentally, brought about the engagement of her son, Major Druce, with the Princess de Loveday. This princess is a beauty and an heiress, and although of Turkish parentage, has been brought up under European influence in Cairo. Is anything known of the antecedents of Mademoiselle Cunier? Very little. She came to Mrs. Druce from a certain Lady Gwynn, who had brought her to England from an orphanage for the daughters of jewellers and watchmakers at Echelay in Geneva. Lady Gwynn intended to make her governess to her young children, but when she saw that the girl's good looks had attracted her husband's attention, she thought better of it, and suggested to Mrs. Druce that Mademoiselle might be useful to her in conducting her foreign correspondence. Mrs. Druce accordingly engaged the young lady to act as her secretary and amanuensis, and appears, on the whole, to have taken to the girl, and to have been on a pleasant, friendly footing with her. I wonder if the Princess de Loveday was on an equally pleasant footing with her, when she saw, as no doubt she did, the attention she received at the Major's hands. Mr. Dyer shrugged his shoulders. The Major's suspicions do not point in that direction, in spite of the fact, which I elicited from him by judicious questioning, that the Princess has a violent and jealous temper, and has at times made his life a burden to him. His suspicions centre solely upon a certain Hafiz Cassimi, son of the Turkish-Egyptian banker of that name. It was at the house of these Cassimis that the Major first met the Princess, and he states that she and young Cassimi are like brother and sister to each other. He says that this young man has had the run of his mother's house, and made himself very much at home in it, for the past 3 weeks. Ever since, in fact, the Princess came to stay with Mrs. Druce, in order to be initiated into the mysteries of English family life. Hafiz Cassimi, according to the Major's account, fell desperately in love with the little Swiss girl, almost at first sight, and pestered her with his attentions, and off and on there appeared to have passed hot words between the two young men. One could scarcely expect a princess with Eastern blood in her veins to be a quiet and passive spectator to such a drama of cross-purposes. Scarcely. The Major, perhaps, hardly takes the Princess sufficiently into his reckoning. According to him, young Cassimi is a thoroughgoing Iago, and he begs me to concentrate attention entirely on him. Cassimi, he says, has stolen the photograph. Cassimi has inveigled the girl out of the house on some pretext, perhaps out of the country also, and he suggests that it might be as well to communicate with the police at Cairo with as little delay as possible. And it hasn't so much as entered his mind that his princess might have a hand in such a plot as that? Apparently not. I think I told you that Mademoiselle had taken no luggage, not so much as a handbag with her. Nothing beyond her coat and hat has disappeared from her wardrobe. Her writing desk, and in fact all her boxes and drawers, have been opened and searched, but no letters or papers of any sort have been found that throw any light upon her movements. At what hour in the day is the girl supposed to have left the house? No one can say for certain. It is conjectured that it was sometime in the afternoon of the 2nd of this month, a week ago today. It was one of Mrs. Druce's big reception days, and with a stream of people going and coming, a young lady more or less leaving the house would scarcely be noticed. I suppose, said Loveday, after a moment's pause, this Princess de Loveday has something of a history. One does not often get a Turkish princess in London. Yes, she has a history. She is only remotely connected with the present reigning dynasty in Turkey, and I dare say her princess-ship has been made the most of. All the same, however, she has had an altogether exceptional career for an Oriental lady. She was left an orphan at an early age, and was consigned to the guardianship of the elder Cassimi by her relatives. The Cassimis, both father and son, seem to be very advanced and European in their ideas, and by them she was taken to Cairo for her education. About a year ago they brought her out in London, where she made the acquaintance of Major Druce. The young man, by the way, appears to be rather hot-headed in his love-making, for within 6 weeks of his introduction to her, their engagement was announced. No doubt it had Mrs. Druce's fullest approval, for knowing her son's extravagant habits and his numerous debts, it must have been patent to her that a rich wife was a necessity to him. The marriage, I believe, was to have taken place this season, but taking into consideration the young man's ill-advised attentions to the little Swiss girl, and the fervour he is throwing into the search for her, I should say it was exceedingly doubtful whether— "Major Druce, sir, wishes to see you," said a clerk, at that moment opening the door leading from the outer office. "Oh, very good. Show him in," said Mr. Dyer. Then he turned to Loveday. "Of course I have spoken to him about you, and he is very anxious to take you to his mother's reception this afternoon, so that you may have a look round and— He broke off, having to rise and greet Major Druce, who at that moment entered the room. He was a tall, handsome young fellow of about 7 or 8 and 20, well turned out from head to foot, moustache waxed, orchid in buttonhole, light kid gloves, and patent leather boots. There was assuredly nothing in his appearance to substantiate his statement to Mr. Dyer that he hadn't slept a wink all night, that in fact another 24 hours of this terrible suspense would send him into his grave. Mr. Dyer introduced Miss Brooke, and she expressed her sympathy with him on the painful matter that was filling his thoughts. "It is very good of you, I'm sure," he replied, in a slow, soft drawl, not unpleasant to listen to. "My mother receives this afternoon from 4:30 to 6:30, and I shall be very glad if you will allow me to introduce you to the inside of our house, and to the very ill-looking set that we have somehow managed to gather about us." "The ill-looking set?" "Yes. Jews, Turks, heretics, and infidels, all there. And they're on the increase, too, that's the worst of it. Every week a fresh importation from Cairo." Mrs. Druce is a large-hearted, benevolent woman," interposed Mr. Dyer. "All nationalities gather within her walls." "Was your mother a large-hearted, benevolent woman?" said the young man, turning upon him. "No? Well, then, thank Providence that she wasn't, and admit that you know nothing at all on the matter. Miss Brooke," he continued, turning to Loveday, "I brought round my hansom for you. It's nearly 4:30 now, and it's a good 20 minutes' drive from here to Portland Place. If you're ready, I'm at your service." Major Druce's hansom was, like himself, in all respects well turned out, and the india-rubber tyres round its wheels allowed an easy flow of conversation to be kept up during the 20 minutes' drive from Lynch Court to Portland Place. The Major led off the talk in frank and easy fashion. "My mother," he said, "prides herself on being cosmopolitan in her tastes, and just now we are very cosmopolitan indeed. Even our servants represent diverse nationalities. The butler is French, the 2 footmen Italians. The maids, I believe, are some of them German, some Irish, and I've no doubt if you penetrated to the kitchen quarters you'd find the staff there composed in part of Scandinavians, in part of South Sea Islanders. The other quarters of the globe you will find fully represented in the drawing-room." Loveday had a direct question to ask. "Are you certain that Mademoiselle Cunier had no friends in England?" she said. "Positive. She hadn't a friend in the world outside my mother's 4 walls, poor child. She told me more than once that she was seule sur la terre." He broke off for a moment, as if overcome by a sad memory, then added, "But I'll put a bullet into him, take my word for it, if she isn't found within another 24 hours. Personally, I should prefer settling the brute in that fashion to handing him over to the police." His face flushed a deep red. There came a sudden flash to his eye, but for all that, his voice was as soft and slow and unemotional as though he were talking of nothing more serious than bringing down a partridge. There fell a brief pause. Then Loveday asked another question. "Is Mademoiselle Catholic or Protestant? Can you tell me?" The Major thought for a moment, then replied, "Upon my word, I don't know. She used sometimes to attend a little charge in South Savile Street. I've walked with her occasionally to the church door, but I couldn't for the life of me say whether it was a Catholic, Protestant, or pagan place of worship. But you don't think those confounded priests have—" "Here we are in Portland Place," interrupted Loveday. "Mrs. Druce's rooms are already full, to judge from that long line of carriages." "Miss Brooke," said the Major, suddenly bethinking himself of his responsibilities. "How am I to introduce you? What role will you take up this afternoon? Pose as a faddist of some sort, if you want to win my mother's heart. What do you say to having started a grand scheme for supplying Hottentots and Kaffirs with eyeglasses? My mother would swear eternal friendship with you at once." "Don't introduce me at all at first," answered Loveday. "Get me into some quiet corner, where I can see without being seen. Later on in the afternoon, when I have had time to look round a little, I'll tell you whether it will be necessary to introduce me or not." "It will be a mob this afternoon, and no mistake," said Major Druce, as side by side they entered the house. "Do you hear that fizzing and clucking just behind us? That's Arabic. You'll get it in whiffs, between gusts of French and German, all the afternoon. The Egyptian contingent seems to be in full force today. I don't see any Choctaw Indians, but no doubt they'll send their representatives later on. Come in at this side door, and we'll work our way round to that big palm. My mother is sure to be at the principal doorway." The drawing-rooms were packed from end to end, and Major Druce's progress, as he headed Loveday through the crowd, was impeded by hand-shaking and the interchange of civilities with his mother's guests. Eventually the big palm, standing in a Chinese cistern, was reached, and there, half-screened from view by its graceful branches, he placed a chair for Miss Brooke. From this quiet nook, as now and again the crowd parted, Loveday could command a fair view of both drawing-rooms. "Don't attract attention to me by standing at my elbow," she whispered to the Major. He answered her whisper with another. "There's the beast! Iago, I mean," he said. "Do you see him? He's standing talking to that fair, handsome woman in pale green, with a picture hat. She's Lady Gwyn. And there's my mother. And there's Dolly, the princess, I mean, alone on the sofa. Ah, you can't see her now for the crowd. Yes, I'll go, but if you want me, just nod to me, and I shall understand." It was easy to see what had brought such a fashionable crowd to Mrs. Druce's rooms that afternoon. Every caller, as soon as she had shaken hands with the hostess, passed on to the princess's sofa, and there waited patiently till opportunity presented itself for an introduction to her Eastern Highness. Loveday found it impossible to get more than the merest glimpse of her, and so transferred her attention to Mr. Hafiz Cassimi, who had been referred to in such unceremonious language by Major Druce. He was a swarthy, well-featured man, with bold black eyes, and lips that had the habit of parting now and again, not to smile, but as if for no other purpose than to show a double row of gleaming white teeth. The European dress he wore seemed to accord ill with the man, and Loveday could fancy that those black eyes and that double row of white teeth would have shown to better advantage beneath a turban or a fez cap. From Cassimi her eye wandered to Mrs. Druce, a tall, stout woman, dressed in black velvet, and with hair mounted high on her head, that had the appearance of being either bleached or powdered. She gave Loveday the impression of being that essentially modern product of modern society, the woman who combines in one person the hard-working philanthropist with the hard-working woman of fashion. As arrivals began to slacken, she left her post near the door and began to make the round of the room, From snatches of talk that came to her where she sat, Loveday could gather that with one hand, as it were, this energetic lady was organising a grand charity concert, and with the other pushing the interests of a big ball that was shortly to be given by the officers of her son's regiment. It was a hot June day. In spite of closed blinds and open windows, the rooms were stifling to a degree. The butler, a small, dark, slight Frenchman, made his way through the throng to a window at Loveday's right hand, to see if a little more air could be admitted. Major Druce followed on his heels to Loveday's side. "Will you come into the next room and have some tea?" he asked. "I'm sure you must feel nearly suffocated here." He broke off, then added in a lower tone, "I hope you have kept your eyes on the beast. Did you ever in your life see a more repulsive-looking animal?" Loveday took his questions in their order. "No tea, thank you," she said, "but I shall be glad if you will tell your butler to bring me a glass of water. There he is, at your elbow. Yes, off and on I have been studying Mr. Cassimi, and I must admit I do not like his smileless smile." The butler brought the water. The Major, much to his annoyance, was seized upon simultaneously by two ladies, one eager to know if any tidings had been received of Mademoiselle Cunier, the other anxious to learn if a distinguished president to the harem mission had been decided upon. Soon after 6, the rooms began to thin somewhat, and presentations to the princess ceasing, Loveday was able to get a full view of her. She presented a striking picture, seated, half reclining, on a sofa, with two white-robed, dark-skinned Egyptian maidens standing behind it. A more unfortunate sobriquet than Dolly could scarcely have been found by the Major for this oriental beauty, with her olive complexion, her flashing eyes, and extravagant richness of attire. Queen of Sheba would be far more appropriate, thought Loveday. She turns the commonplace sofa into a throne, and, I should say, makes every one of those ladies feel as if she ought to have donned court dress and plumes for the occasion. It was difficult for her, from where she sat, to follow the details of the princess's dress. She could only see that a quantity of soft orange-tinted silk was wound about the upper part of her arms, and fell from her shoulders like drooping wings, and that here and there jewels flashed out from its folds. Her thick black hair was loosely knotted, and kept in its place by jewelled pins, and a bandeau of pearls, and similar bandeaus adorned her slender throat and wrists. "Are you lost in admiration?" said the Major, once more at her elbow, in a slightly sarcastic tone. "That sort of thing is very taking and effective at first, but after a time—" He did not finish his sentence, shrugged his shoulders, and walked away. 6:30 chimed from a small clock on a bracket. Carriage after carriage was rolling away from the door now, and progress on the stairs was rendered difficult by a descending crowd. 7:15 struck. The last handshaking had been gone through, and Mrs. Druce, looking hot and tired, had sunk into a chair at the princess's right hand, bending slightly forward to render conversation with her easy. On the princess's left hand, Lady Gwyn had taken a chair, and sat in converse with her fils Cassimi, who stood beside her. Evidently these four were on very easy and intimate terms with each other. Lady Gwyn had tossed her big picture hat on a chair at her left hand, and was fanning herself with a palm leaf. Mrs. Druce, beckoning to the butler, desired him to bring them some claret cup from the refreshment room. No one seemed to observe Loveday, seated still in her nook beside the big palm. She signalled to the Major, who stood looking discontentedly from one of the windows. "That is a most interesting group," she said. "Now, if you like, you may introduce me to your mother." "Oh, with pleasure. Under what name?" he asked. "Under my own," she answered. "And please be very distinct in pronouncing it. Raise your voice slightly, so that every one of those persons may hear it. And then, please add my profession, and say I am here at your request, to investigate the circumstances connected with Mademoiselle Cunier's disappearance." Major Druce looked astounded. But, he stammered, "have you seen anything? Found out anything? If not, don't you think it will be better to preserve your incognita a little longer?" "Don't stop to ask questions," said Loveday sharply. "Now, this very minute, do what I ask you, or the opportunity will be gone." The Major, without further demur, escorted Loveday across the room. The conversation between the four intimate friends had now become general and animated, and he had to wait for a minute or so before he could get an opportunity to speak to his mother. During that minute, Loveday stood a little in his rear, with Lady Gwyn and Cassimi at her right hand. "I want to introduce this lady to you," said the Major, when a pause in the talk gave him his opportunity. "This is Miss Loveday Brooke, a lady detective, and she is here, at my request, to investigate the circumstances connected with the disappearance of Mademoiselle Cunier." He said the words slowly and distinctly. "There," he said to himself complacently as he ended. "If I had been reading the lessons in church, I couldn't have been more emphatic." A blank silence for a moment fell upon the group, and even the butler, just then entering with the claret cup, came to a standstill at the door. Then, simultaneously, a glance flashed from Mrs. Druce to Lady Gwyn, from Lady Gwyn to Mrs. Druce, and then, also simultaneously, the eyes of both ladies rested, though only for an instant, on the big picture hat lying on the chair. Lady Gwyn started to her feet, and seized her hat, adjusting it without so much as a glance at a mirror. "I must go at once, this very minute," she said. "I promised Charlie I would be back soon after 6, and now it is past 7. Mr. Cassimi, will you take me down to my carriage?" And with the most hurried of leave-takings to the Princess and her hostess, the lady swept out of the room, followed by Mr. Cassimi. The butler, still standing at the door, drew back to allow the lady to pass, and then, claret cup and all, followed her out of the room. Mrs. Druce drew a long breath, and bowed formally to Loveday. "I was a little taken by surprise," she began. But here the Princess rose suddenly from the sofa. "Moi, je suis fatiguée," she said in excellent French to Mrs. Druce, and she too swept out of the room, throwing, as she passed, what seemed to Loveday a slightly scornful glance towards the Major. Her two attendants, one carrying her fan and the other her reclining cushions, followed. Mrs. Druce again turned to Loveday. "Yes, I confess I was taken a little by surprise," she said, her manner thawing slightly. "I am not accustomed to the presence of detectives in my house, but now tell me, what do you propose doing? How do you mean to begin your investigations? By going over the house and looking in all the corners, or by cross-questioning the servants? Forgive my asking, but really I am quite at a loss. I haven't the remotest idea how such investigations are generally conducted." "I do not propose to do much in the way of investigation tonight," answered Loveday, as formally as she had been addressed, "for I have very important business to transact before 8 o'clock this evening. I shall ask you to allow me to see Mademoiselle Cunier's room. 10 minutes there will be sufficient. After that, I do not think I need further trouble you." "Certainly, by all means," answered Mrs. Druce. "You'll find the room exactly as Lucy left it. Nothing has been disturbed." She turned to the butler, who had by this time returned, and stood presenting the claret cup, and, in French, desired him to summon her maid, and tell her to show Miss Brooke to Mademoiselle Cunier's room. The 10 minutes that Loveday had said would suffice for her survey of this room extended themselves to 15. But the extra 5 minutes assuredly were not expended by her in the investigation of drawers and boxes. The maid, a pleasant, well-spoken young woman, jingled her keys and opened every lock, and seemed not at all disinclined to enter into the light gossip that Loveday contrived to set going. She answered freely a variety of questions that Loveday put to her respecting Mademoiselle and her general habits, and from Mademoiselle the talk drifted to other members of Mrs. Druce's household. If Loveday had, as she had stated, important business to transact that evening, she certainly set about it in a strange fashion. After she quitted Mademoiselle's room, she went straight out of the house, without leaving a message of any sort for either Mrs. or Major Druce. She walked the length of Portland Place, in leisurely fashion, and then, having first ascertained that her movements were not being watched, she called a hansom, and desired the man to drive her to Madame Celine's, a fashionable milliner's in Old Bond Street. At Madame Celine's she spent close upon half an hour, giving many and minute directions for the making of a hat, which assuredly, when finished, would compare with nothing in the way of millinery that she had ever before put upon her head. From Madame Celine's, the hansom conveyed her to an undertaker's shop at the corner of South Savile Street, and here she spent a brief 10 minutes in conversation with the undertaker himself in his little back parlour. From the undertaker's, she drove home to her rooms in Gower Street, and then, before she divested herself of hat and coat, she wrote a brief note to Major Druce, requesting him to meet her on the following morning at Glace's, the confectioner's, in South Savile Street, at 9 o'clock punctually. This note she committed to the charge of the cab driver, desiring him to deliver it at Portland Place on his way back to his stand. "They've queer ways of doing things, these people," said the Major, as he opened and read the note. "Suppose I must keep the appointment, though, confound it. I can't see that she can possibly have found out anything by just sitting still in a corner for a couple of hours, and I'm confident she didn't give that beast Cassimi 1/4 the attention she bestowed on other people." In spite of his grumbling, however, the Major kept his appointment, and 9 o'clock the next morning saw him shaking hands with Miss Brooke on Glace's doorstep. "Dismiss your hansom," she said to him. "I only want you to come a few doors down the street, to the French Protestant church, to which you have sometimes escorted Mademoiselle Cunier." At the church door, Loveday paused a moment. "Before we enter," she said, "I want you to promise that whatever you may see going on there, however greatly you may be surprised, you will make no disturbance, not so much as open your lips till we come out." The Major, not a little bewildered, gave the required promise, and, side by side, the two entered the church. It was little more than a big room. At the farther end, in the middle of the nave, stood the pulpit, and immediately behind this was a low platform, enclosed by a brass rail. Behind this brass rail, in black Geneva gown, stood the pastor of the church, and before him, on cushions, kneeled 2 persons, a man and a woman. These 2 persons, and an old man, the verger, formed the whole of the congregation. The position of the church, amid shops and narrow backyards, had necessitated the filling in of every one of its windows with stained glass. It was, consequently, so dim that, coming in from the outside glare of sunlight, the Major found it difficult to make out what was going on at the farther end. The verger came forward and offered to show them to a seat. Loveday shook her head. They would be leaving in a minute, she said, and would prefer standing where they were. The Major began to take in the situation. "Why, they're being married," he said, in a loud whisper. "What on earth have you brought me in here for?" Loveday laid her finger on her lips, and frowned severely at him. The marriage service came to an end. The pastor extended his black-gowned arms like the wings of a bat, and pronounced the benediction. The man and woman rose from their knees, and proceeded to follow him into the vestry. The woman was neatly dressed in a long dove-coloured travelling cloak. She wore a large hat, from which fell a white gossamer veil that completely hid her face from view. The man was small, dark, and slight, and, as he passed on to the vestry beside his bride, the Major at once identified him as his mother's butler. "Why, that's Lebrun," he said, in a still louder whisper than before. "Why, in the name of all that's wonderful, have you brought me here to see that fellow married?" "You'd better come outside, if you can't keep quiet," said Loveday severely, and leading the way out of the church as she spoke. Outside, South Savile Street was busy with early morning traffic. "Let us go back to Glacé's," said Loveday, "and have some coffee. I will explain to you there all you are wishing to know." But before the coffee could be brought to them, the Major had asked at least a dozen questions. Loveday put them all on one side. "All in good time," she said. "You are leaving out the most important question of all. Have you no curiosity to know who was the bride that Lebrun has chosen?" "I don't suppose it concerns me in the slightest degree," he answered indifferently. "But since you wish me to ask the question, who was she?" "Lucie Cunier, lately your mother's amanuensis." Cried the Major, jumping to his feet and uttering an exclamation that must be indicated by a blank. "Take it calmly," said Loveday. "Don't rave. Sit down, and I'll tell you all about it. No, it is not the doing of your friend Cassimi, so you need not threaten to put a bullet into him. The girl has married Lebrun of her own free will. No one has forced her into it." "Lucie has married Lebrun of her own free will?" he echoed, growing very white and taking the chair which faced Loveday at the little table. "Will you have sugar?" asked Loveday, stirring the coffee, which the waiter at that moment brought. "Yes, I repeat," she presently resumed. "Lucie has married Lebrun of her own free will, although I conjecture she might not perhaps have been quite so willing to crown his happiness if the Princess de Lavey had not made it greatly to her interest to do so." "Dolly made it to her interest to do so?" again echoed the Major. "Do not interrupt me with exclamations. Let me tell the story my own fashion, and then you may ask as many questions as you please. Now, to begin at the beginning, Lucie became engaged to Lebrun within a month of her coming to your mother's house, but she carefully kept the secret from everyone, even from the servants, until about a month ago, when she mentioned the fact in confidence to Mrs. Druce, in order to defend herself from the charge of having sought to attract your attention. There was nothing surprising in this engagement. They were both lonely and in a foreign land, spoke the same language, and no doubt had many things in common. And, although chance has lifted Lucie somewhat out of her station, she really belongs to the same class in life as Lebrun. Their love-making appears to have run along smoothly enough until you came home on leave, and the girl's pretty face attracted your attention. Your evident admiration for her disturbed the equanimity of the princess, who saw your devotion to herself waning, of Lebrun, who fancied Lucie's manner to him had changed, of your mother, who was anxious that you should make a suitable marriage. Also, additional complications arose from the fact that your attentions to the little Swiss girl had drawn Mr. Cassimi's notice to her numerous attractions, and there was the danger of you two young men posing as rivals. At this juncture, Lady Gwyn, as an intimate friend, and one who had herself suffered a twinge of heartache on Mademoiselle's account, was taken into your mother's confidence, and the three ladies in council decided that Lucie, in some fashion, must be got out of the way before you and Mr. Cassimi came to an open breach, or you had spoilt your matrimonial prospects. Here the Major made a slightly impatient movement. Loveday went on. It was the Princess who solved the question how this was to be done. Fair Rosamonds are no longer put out of the way by a cup of cold poison. Golden guineas do the thing far more easily and innocently. The Princess expressed her willingness to bestow £1,000 on Lucie on the day that she married Lebrun, and to set her up afterwards as a fashionable milliner in Paris. After this munificent offer, everything else became mere matter of detail. The main thing was to get the damsel out of the way without your being able to trace her, perhaps work on her feelings, and induce her, at the last moment, to throw over Lebrun. Your absence from home on a 3 days' visit gave them the wished-for opportunity. Lady Gwyn took her milliner into her confidence. Madame Céline consented to receive Lucie into her house, seclude her in a room on the upper floor, and at the same time give her an insight into the profession of a fashionable milliner. The rest I think you know. Lucie quietly walks out of the house one afternoon, taking no luggage, calling no cab, and thereby cutting off one very obvious means of being traced. Madame Céline receives and hides her, not a difficult feat to accomplish in London, more especially if the one to be hidden is a foreign amanuensis who is seldom seen out of doors, and who leaves no photograph behind her. I suppose it was Lebrun who had the confounded cheek to go to my drawer and appropriate that photograph. I wish it had been Cassini. I could have kicked him, but it makes one feel rather small to have posed as rival to one's mother's butler. I think you may congratulate yourself that Lebrun did nothing worse than go to your drawer and appropriate that photograph. I never saw a man bestow a more deadly look of hatred than he threw at you yesterday afternoon in your mother's drawing-room. It was that look of hatred that first drew my attention to the man, and set me on the track that has ended in the Swiss Protestant Church this morning. Ah, let me hear about that. Let me have the links in the chain, one by one, as you came upon them, said the Major. He was still pale, almost as the marble table at which they sat, but his voice had gone back to its normal, slow, soft drawl. With pleasure. The look that Lebrun threw at you, as he crossed the room to open the window, was link number 1. As I saw that look, I said to myself, there is someone in that corner whom that man hates with a deadly hatred. Then you came forward to speak to me, and I saw that it was you that the man was ready to murder, if opportunity offered. After this I scrutinized him closely. Not a detail of his features or his dress escaped me, and I noticed, among other things, that on the 4th finger of his left hand, half hidden by a more pretentious ring, was an old-fashioned, curious-looking silver one. That silver ring was link number 2 in the chain. Ah, I suppose you asked for that glass of water on purpose, to get a closer view of the ring. I did. I found it was a Genevese ring, of ancient make, the like of which I had not seen since I was a child, and played with one that my old Swiss bonne used to wear. Now, I must tell you a little bit of Genevese history before I can make you understand how important a link that silver ring was to me. Échalet, the town in which Lucie was born, and her father had kept a watchmaker's shop, has long been famous for its jewellery and watchmaking. The two trades, however, were not combined in one until about 100 years ago, when the corporation of the town passed a law decreeing that they should unite in one guild for their common good. To celebrate this amalgamation of interests, the jewellers fabricated a certain number of silver rings, consisting of a plain band of silver, on which 2 hands, in relief, clasped each other. These rings were distributed among the members of the guild, and as time has gone on, they have become scarce and valuable as relics of the past. In certain families they have been handed down as heirlooms, and have frequently done duty as betrothal rings, the clasped hands no doubt suggesting their suitability for this purpose. Now, when I saw such a ring on Lebrun's finger, I naturally guessed from whom he had received it, and at once classed his interests with those of your mother and the Princess, and looked upon him as their possible coadjutor. What made you throw the brute Cassimi altogether out of your reckoning?" "I did not do so at this stage of events, only, so to speak, marked him as doubtful, and kept my eye on him. I determined to try an experiment that I have never before attempted in my work. You know what that experiment was. I saw 5 persons, Mrs. Druce, the Princess, Lady Gwyn, Mr. Cassimi, and Lebrun, all in the room within a few yards of each other, and I asked you to take them by surprise, and announce my name and profession, so that every one of those 5 persons could hear you." "You did. I could not for the life of me make out what was your motive for so doing." "My motive for so doing was simply, as it were, to raise the sudden cry, 'The enemy is upon you,' and to set every one of those 5 persons guarding their weak point, that is, if they had one. I'll draw your attention to what followed. Mr. Cassimi remained nonchalant and impassive. Your mother and Lady Gwyn exchanged glances, and they both simultaneously threw a nervous look at Lady Gwyn's hat, lying on the chair. Now, as I had stood waiting to be introduced to Mrs. Druce, I had casually read the name of Madame Céline on the lining of the hat, and I at once concluded that Madame Céline must be a very weak point indeed. A conclusion that was confirmed when Lady Gwyn hurriedly seized her hat, and as hurriedly departed. Then the Princess, scarcely less abruptly, rose and left the room, and Lebrun, on the point of entering, quitted it also. When he returned 5 minutes later, with the claret cup, he had removed the ring from his finger, so I had now little doubt where his weak point lay. "It's wonderful. It's like a fairy tale," drawled the Major. "Pray, go on." "After this," continued Loveday, "my work became very simple. I did not care 2 straws for seeing Mademoiselle's room, but I cared very much to have a talk with Mrs. Druce's maid. From her I elicited the important fact that Lebrun was leaving very unexpectedly on the following day, and that his boxes were packed and labelled for Paris. After I left your house, I drove to Madame Céline's, and there, as a sort of entrance fee, ordered an elaborate hat. I praised freely the hats they had on view, and while giving minute directions as to the one I required, I extracted the information that Madame Céline had recently taken on a new milliner, who had very great artistic skill. Upon this, I asked permission to see this new milliner, and give her special instructions concerning my hat. My request was referred to Madame Céline, who appeared much ruffled by it, and informed me that it would be quite useless for me to see this new milliner. She could execute no more orders, as she was leaving the next day for Paris, where she intended opening an establishment on her own account. Now, you see the point at which I had arrived. There was Lebrun, and there was this new milliner, each leaving for Paris on the same day. It was not unreasonable to suppose that they might start in company, and that before so doing a little ceremony might be gone through in the Swiss Protestant church that Mademoiselle occasionally attended. This conjecture sent me to the undertaker in South Savile Street, who combines with his undertaking the office of verger to the little church. From him I learned that a marriage was to take place at the church at 8:45 the next morning, and that the names of the contracting parties were Pierre Lebrun and Lucie Cunier. "Cunier?" "Yes, that is the girl's real name. It seems Lady Gwyn rechristened her Cunier, because she said the English pronunciation of Cunier grated on her ear. People would insist upon adding a G after the N. She introduced her to Mrs. Druce under the name of Cunier, forgetting, perhaps, the girl's real name, or else thinking it a matter of no importance. This fact, no doubt, considerably lessened Lebrun's fear of detection in procuring his licence and transmitting it to the Swiss pastor. Perhaps you are a little surprised at my knowledge of the facts I related to you at the beginning of our conversation. I got at them through Lebrun this morning. At 8:30 I went down to the church and found him there, waiting for his bride. He grew terribly excited at seeing me, and thought I was going to bring you down on him and upset his wedding arrangements at the last moment. I assured him to the contrary, and his version of the facts I have handed on to you. Should, however, any details of the story seem to you to be lacking, I have no doubt that Mrs. Druce or the Princess will supply them, now that all necessity for secrecy has come to an end." The Major drew on his gloves. His colour had come back to him. He had resumed his easy suavity of manner. "I don't think," he said slowly, "I'll trouble my mother or the Princess, and I shall be glad, if you have the opportunity, if you will make people understand that I only moved in the matter at all out of mere kindness to a young and friendless foreigner." You've been listening to a bite-sized audiobook, read by me, Simon Stanhope. If you'd like to help me to keep producing new content, you can find links in the video description to my Patreon page, or to buy me a coffee. Another way to support me is through my Bandcamp page, bitesizedaudio.bandcamp.com, where you can hear my narrations of many more classic short stories, and you can also purchase and download them to keep. This recording is copyright Bitesized Audio 2023. Thank you for listening.